So we are going to start with trigonometry today, and we're going to find trigonometric ratios while we use right triangles. And what I guess you need to know is trig, just a branch of math that deals with the ratios between the sides of a right triangle with reference to the acute angles of a right triangle. So every right triangle has a 90-degree angle. The other two angles have to be less than 90, so those guys are called acute. So if you look at the triangle ABC below, little a is the length of the leg that's opposite angle A. So if you look at angle A, big A, opposite it is going to be little a. If you look at little b is opposite the angle B. So little b is the leg that's opposite angle B, and little c is the length of the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is always going to be the longest side, always opposite the right angle. Depending on the acute angle that you're using, the leg that is attached to the angle, but it's not the hypotenuse, happens to be called the adjacent. ADJECENT. So what that kind of means is something like this. If we were to take a look at this particular acute angle A, this is the hypotenuse, little c, and it's always going to be the hypotenuse. Little a is the leg opposite, angle A, but little b is the adjacent side. It's the adjacent leg because it's attached to A. Okay? If we switch this thing up and we change the acute angle that we were referring to, and we now talk about the acute angle B, well, the hypotenuse can never change. It's always opposite the right angle. But now the leg that's opposite angle B happens to be little b. And the leg that's attached, that's not the hypotenuse to angle B, is the adjacent. So what you need to be able to do is find the different ratios. And in trigonometry, we talk about sine, which happens to be abbreviated on your calculator as SIN. We talk about cosine, which is abbreviated as COS. And we talk about tangent, which is just TAN. And these sine, cosine, tangent vocab words are really talking about the ratio of the sides in reference to the acute angles that we're dealing with. So if we wanted to talk about the ratios, there's a mnemonic that you need to remember, and that mnemonic is called SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA, and I'm going to put this on a separate page. SOHCAHTOA is spelled like this, and I'm going to spell it as a ratio, SOHCAHTOA. In other words, it really comes from this, SOHCAHTOA. And all these letters stand for something. The S stands for the sine. The C stands for the cosine. The T stands for the tangent. And then the O and the H and the A should look familiar because any O stands for the opposite. Any A stands for the adjacent. And any H stands for the hypotenuse. Okay, so the trig ratio is the sine equals the opposite leg over the hypotenuse. The cosine equals the adjacent leg over the hypotenuse, and the tangent's the opposite over the hypotenuse. Here's how this actually works. I'm going to go back up. So using SOHCAHTOA, which you need to remember how to spell, so using SOHCAHTOA, SOHCAHTOA, you need to set up your ratios. So if we're talking about the sine of angle A, so here's angle A, opposite angle A is little a, adjacent to angle A is little b, and the hypotenuse is little c. So sine is the opposite over the adjacent. So the sine of angle A would be the opposite leg, which is little a, over the hypotenuse. I think I said adjacent, but I meant hypotenuse. Over the hypotenuse, which is little c. The cosine of A is adjacent over hypotenuse. Well, adjacent to angle A is little b. The hypotenuse is still c. The tangent of angle A is opposite over adjacent. So the opposite leg is little a, and the adjacent leg is little b. If we change it up, and now we talk about B being our angle, well, the hypotenuse stays the same, but now little b turns into the opposite leg, and little a turns into the adjacent leg. So sine of b is O over h. Well, the opposite leg is now little b, hypotenuse is little c. Cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse, little a, over, whoopsie, over c. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent, which is little b over little a. We're going to actually be doing this with numbers, so it's going to make it a lot easier, or just a little bit different looking. So if we go and look on this next slide, not that one, this one, find the indicated trig ratio in simplest form. So ratios are just fractions, and you're going to put them in simplest form. Again, SOHCAHTOA, you're going to memorize how to spell it, and you're never going to forget it. So sine of A. If A is the angle I'm referring to, then 8 is the opposite leg, 6 is the adjacent leg, 10 is the hypotenuse. So the sine is O over h, which is 6 over 10, and that simplifies into 3 over 5. Cosine of A ends up being adjacent over hypotenuse. Did that again. So hold on, I think I messed this one up. Let me back up for a second. This should be 8 over 10, right? So let's go back up. That is a little problem. Okay, back up to sine for a second. Opposite, 8 over 10. So if you thought I was doing that wrong, you were correct, I was. So when I simplify that, it's going to be 4/5. Cosine is A over h, that's 6 over 10, and that's the one that's 3/5. And then the tangent is O over A, which becomes 8 over 6. And we don't want anything in mixed numbers. You've got to keep it in proper, which is 4/3. When we start changing sides, and now we want to go or changing angles, and now we start talking about angle B, hypotenuse doesn't change, but the opposite leg turns into the adjacent leg, and the adjacent turns into the opposite. So in this case, the sine of B becomes 6/10. And that's 3/5. The cosine of B is A over h, which in this case becomes 8/10, which turns into 4/5. And then the tangent of B becomes O over A, which is 6 over 8, which is 3 over 4. Okay? So now what's happening is we're going to actually have you calculate just sine, cosine, and tangents. So we're having you calculate the ratios, and then we're also going to have you calculate the missing angles given the ratios. So when you study trig, your calculator has to be in degree mode. Degree mode is huge. If you're not in degree mode, all of your answers are going to be wrong because we're dealing with angle measures, and angles are measured in degree. So on your graphing calculator, when you have that thing turned on, you need to go to mode. And mode is there on the upper left-hand corner. If you go down to the third spot, everything is always in radians, but you want to turn everything into degrees. So your arrow on top of degree, you hit enter. And once degree is blinking, you're good to go. So I'm going to go back to my home screen. I'm going to second quit. So what you're going to be doing with trig is we're going to be saying to you, okay, well, these are the angle measures, and we want you to find the ratio of the sides. So you should also notice on your calculator that you've got the sine button, you've got this cosine button, and you've got this tangent button. It always opens up a parenthesis, so you're going to actually put things in parentheses. So if I want the sine of 38 degrees, I'm going to type in sine. I type in the number 38. I'm going to close up my parentheses. I'm going to get this really big decimal. We want you to go to the nearest 10,000th. 10,000th is 4 places, so the 5th decimal tells you what to do to the 4th. So 61566 becomes 6157. So 0.6157. And then we go to the next one. Cosine, 24 degrees. So those two sides, when I do the ratio, gives me a decimal equivalent of this. We want it to 4 decimal places. Look at the 5th, so it's 0.9135. And then tangent 85, let's do this again, tan 85 parentheses, and then this becomes 11.4301. 11.4301, 4301, sorry. So 4301. Okay, so very easy to find the ratios in decimal form if you're given the angle measure. By the way, 10,000th is 4 decimals. Last but not least, you want to be able to find the angle measures when you're given the decimals. And when you're given the decimals, or you're even given a fraction per se, but these are the decimals, you're going to be looking for the angles. And the angles happen to be the inverse functions. So use inverses when finding angles. Okay, so if you look at your calculator, above sine, you see in yellow sine -1, and above cosine, you see cosine -1, and above tan, you see tan -1. Those -1s are inverses. So what you're going to have to do here is you're basically looking for the inverse function. So the cosine of -1 has to give you that value. And so what you're doing is you're saying, okay, well, I want the inverse cosine. I want to know what's the cosine that's going to give me, measure the angle I'm going to get when I use 0.7547. So when I use that particular decimal, what's the angle measure that should be spit out? And that would be 41 degrees. When I want the sine of the angle, it's sine -1. And I'm going to do second sine, and I'm going to type in that decimal equivalent, 9781. Oopsie, get the 1 in there. And then what comes out here is 77.9, which is going to round to 78 degrees. And now for the tan of the angle, since I need to find the angle, I need to use the inverse function. Oops, where'd you go, calculator? And then I'll do second tan, and then that's 1.3723. And that decimal, that angle comes out to be 53.9 or 54 degrees. So in your homework, you're going to be having to find missing ratios when you're given the angles, which is just regular trig functions. And then you're going to be finding the angles given the ratios, and that's the inverse functions. Alrighty, good.